Welcome to the most intense and dramatic story of a power struggle within a neighborhood HOA. When I moved into my new house, all I wanted was a peaceful life. Little did I know, Karen, now the HOA president, would turn my life into an endless battle. From petty violations to dark schemes, this story is not just about protecting personal rights, but a fight between power and justice. Will I be able to defeat Karen and restore peace to the community? Stay tuned to find out. The moment I stepped outside and saw Margot's rose garden flourishing like it had been cared for by nature's own magic, while my lawn, managed by a top-tier irrigation system I designed myself, was withering like it had been abandoned in the desert, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just odd, it was outright wrong. I lived in a neighborhood where every inch of green space was a symbol of status, a competition in itself. So when my meticulously maintained lawn started to wither, while Margot's garden thrived, like a landscaping magazine cover, I knew the universe was playing tricks on me. What really hit me was the water bill, nearly doubled. I lived alone, no kids, no pool parties, no hot tubs. So, unless my garden hose had developed a thirsty habit, someone was stealing my water. I never expected the thief would be the very same woman who once fined me for leaving my trash bins out 20 minutes past pickup time. I was immediately on high alert. I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I checked for leaks. After hours of digging and testing, I found no issue. I even ran through my irrigation logs. Everything ran on schedule. Still, the moisture sensors reported excessive drainage. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was messing with my system. But this wasn't just any neighborhood. One guy tried to patent his lawn stripes, so paranoia was almost a given. Still, something didn't sit right, and I decided to dig deeper. I set up a camera near the control box, hiding it so no one would notice. For 3 days, nothing. Just when I was starting to lose hope, the footage came in. There she was, Margot in full stealth mode, if you could call a neon pink tracksuit stealthy. She walked right up to the hose valve, attached a splitter, and ran a hose under her fence. Then she looked directly at the camera, smiled and waved before walking away. It wasn't just theft, it was an act of defiance. Margot wasn't hiding it, she was flaunting it. She was stealing my water to keep her precious roses blooming, while my lawn lay in ruin. I knew I had to act, but confronting her directly seemed risky. I remembered Riley's encounter with her, when she had trespassed on his property to measure fence height, only for him to get slapped with fines and random inspections. Margot ruled with an iron fist, and I wasn't about to give her any more ammunition. But I wasn't any ordinary neighbor. I was an irrigation engineer with a gift for creative solutions. If Margot wanted water, I'd give her water, but it wouldn't be the kind she expected. The next morning, a crisp white envelope was taped to my door. This time, it wasn't just a casual warning. It was a formal complaint from the HOA, demanding an immediate hearing regarding my front yard, which Margot, of course, had deemed neglected and out of compliance with the neighborhood standards. I almost laughed when I read it. My lawn was pristine. I'd barely been in the house a week. And there was Margot, as always, acting like the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, trying to enforce rules she made up herself. I glanced out the window and sure enough, there she was, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for me to slip up. I knew this was coming. The hearing was set for later that day, and I walked into the HOA office with a sense of determination. Margot was already seated, her papers neatly spread out before her. The other board members looked like they were just going through the motions. Greg, the vice president, barely looked up as I sat down. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, clearly tired of Margot's antics. Margot immediately launched into her presentation, flipping through her papers dramatically. "As you can see," she began, "this homeowner has repeatedly violated our community standards. His lawn is overgrown, his deliveries are excessive, and his porch is cluttered." She shot me a glance, clearly relishing the opportunity to take me down a peg. "He's disrupting the harmony of our beautiful neighborhood." I leaned back in my chair, feeling calm but confident. "Margot," I said, "my lawn is mowed. My porch has one chair, and I get deliveries just like anyone else here." Her face turned bright red as she tried to counter, but I was ready. "Do you have any actual evidence?" I asked. She pulled out a few photos. One of my grass with a slightly taller blade, another of my trash bins, and the last of a lone Amazon package on my porch. "Seriously?" I said, laughing. "Is this what you're calling violations?" Margot's nostrils flared. "This is serious," she barked. "We cannot allow homeowners to lower property values." I leaned in. "Actually, Margot, let's talk about your violations." I slid my own folder across the table. For example, the community guidelines say trash cans can't be left outside for more than 6 hours after pickup. Here's a picture of your bins left out the next morning. Her face drained of color. "That's irrelevant," she muttered. "Oh, but wait, there's more." I continued flipping through my folder. According to Guideline 14B, all vehicles must be parked in driveways or garages. But here's a picture of your car parked on the street again. And let's not forget your unapproved patio extension. Greg glanced at Margot. "Is this true?" Margot faltered. "That's different," she said, "but the damage had been done." Greg sighed. "Margot, we've had enough of this. You can't keep making false claims when you're breaking half the rules yourself." The room was silent. "Case dismissed," Greg announced. "Margot, you need to sort out your violations immediately." I sat back in my chair, a small smile forming on my face as Margot's world crumbled. But I knew this wasn't the end. She wouldn't give up so easily. As I left the meeting, I overheard her muttering to herself, "I'll find another way." I smiled. Let her try. The days after the meeting were eerily quiet. There were no more violation notices, and Margot seemed to have gone silent, almost too silent. I expected some kind of retaliation, but none came. For a moment, I thought the battle was finally over, but as with all things Margot, it couldn't possibly be that simple. 2 days later, the quiet was shattered by a new letter from the HOA. This wasn't another violation notice or a friendly reminder. It was an official eviction notice, signed by several board members. It stated that due to ongoing disruptions, I was being asked to vacate my property. My blood ran cold as I read the words. Margot had orchestrated this, using her influence to try and push me out of my own home. I felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could she think she had the right to control my life like this? Sure, she had her grip on the HOA, but I owned this house, and several others in the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let her manipulate me into leaving. Mark was the first to stop by, his grin telling me he knew something was up. "You've really ticked off the Queen, haven't you?" he joked, holding up his coffee mug. I glanced over the letter again. "Can you believe this? She's trying to evict me for no reason at all." He shook his head, laughing lightly. "She doesn't know who she's messing with. You're not some weakling she can push around." I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. There was no way I was going down without a fight. I immediately called Layla, my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no legal grounds for evicting me. What Margot had done was entirely illegal, and she had no right to carry out such a move without going through the proper channels. Layla's calm and reassuring voice was exactly what I needed. "You've got this, Evan. She's overstepping. Let's put an end to this nonsense." I felt a rush of relief, but also the simmering anger of knowing Margot was still trying to use the HOA to attack me. I called an emergency meeting with the HOA, but this time, I wasn't just a resident under attack, I was a property owner who had the power to fight back. When I walked into the meeting room, Margot was sitting smugly at the head of the table. The other board members looked uninterested, some even glancing at their phones. But Margot's smile faded slightly when she saw me take my seat. This time I wasn't just going to roll over. "I'm surprised you even showed up," Margot sneered, trying to maintain control. I leaned forward with a calm smile. "Actually, Margot, I came to discuss something very important. The future of this community." Her confident facade cracked for a split second. "There's nothing to discuss. The decision's been made. You're out." I didn't flinch. "About that, you don't have the authority to evict me. This notice you sent is completely fraudulent. I've already spoken to my lawyer. Consider this a formal cease and desist." Margot's face drained of color as I slid a legal document toward her. "You've made a huge mistake," I said calmly. The room fell into stunned silence. For the first time, Margot looked genuinely shaken, As the board started discussing, I added one more statement that would seal her fate. By the way, I own 10 homes in this neighborhood. That gives me more voting power than even you, and I'd like to propose a vote of no confidence in you as president. The board didn't need much more convincing. Within moments, the vote was unanimous. Margot was out, and the HOA could finally begin to heal. The peace in the neighborhood was short-lived. A few days after Margot's removal from the HOA, I thought the tension had finally eased, but something was still bothering me. The silence felt too perfect, like a calm before the storm. Then one evening, I noticed something odd. Margot's house, once a symbol of HOA perfection, had fallen into disarray. The grass was patchy, the flowers drooping, and the usually pristine door had a note stuck to it. I walked over, curiosity getting the best of me. When I read the note, I felt a cold chill run through me. It was a formal complaint to the HOA, accusing me of disrupting the peace once again and demanding my eviction. The audacity! After everything, she was still trying to take control. I immediately called Layla, who was just as shocked. "Evan, this is insane. But don't worry. We'll take this to court if we need to." I took a deep breath, fighting the anger building up inside me. It was clear that Margot wasn't going to give up so easily. She wasn't just targeting me. She was trying to take back control of everything, including the community. The next day, rumors began to spread. Margot had told several neighbors that I had bribed my way into the HOA, that I was a bad influence, and that I was violating zoning laws. Her whispers were working. People started looking at me differently, even those who had supported me before. But I wasn't going to let her win again. This time, I took matters into my own hands. I started collecting evidence, talking to my neighbors, recording their stories, taking photos of Margot's neglect. It was time to expose her for what she truly was. I called another HOA meeting, but this time I wasn't a victim. I was a man ready to fight back. Margot was seated, her usual smug expression on her face. But the room was different this time. The board members were no longer looking at her with admiration. They were hesitant, unsure. I stood up, pulling out the evidence. "Margot, it's over. The lies you've been spreading, the manipulation, it stops now." I slammed the photos and documents on the table one by one. Margot tried to argue, but the room had already turned against her. She stammered, trying to cover her tracks, but it was too late. The board voted unanimously to censure her for her actions and strip her of any remaining power in the HOA. She was done. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. But more than that, it was about peace. I had fought for my home, and now, finally, the neighborhood could heal. The days following Margot's removal from the HOA were filled with an eerie sense of peace. The neighborhood, which had once felt suffocated under Margot's control, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in ages, there was no one watching over us, making demands or enforcing absurd rules. It felt like the calm before a storm, and sure enough, it didn't take long for that storm to arrive. One morning, while enjoying my coffee on the porch, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of Margot's house. My first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe she was just selling the house or leaving for good. But when I saw her pacing around the front yard, her face flushed with anger, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Hours later, I received a text from Riley. "Evan, you might want to check the HOA mailbox." Margot's making waves again. Looks like she's trying to pull strings from behind the scenes. I was skeptical. Margot had been dethroned. What more could she do? But Riley's message stuck with me, so I decided to check the HOA mailbox. When I opened the letter, my suspicions were confirmed. It was another complaint, this time accusing me of violating HOA rules, specifically about my property's aesthetic compliance. The audacity of it. After everything, she was still trying to control the neighborhood. I immediately called Layla, who responded with the same level of outrage. "Evan, this is ridiculous. Margot may think she can get away with this, but we won't let her. We have the law on our side. We'll take it to court if necessary." Feeling a surge of determination, I decided to gather evidence, photos, witness accounts, and even footage of Margot sneaking around, talking to board members behind closed doors. She had clearly underestimated me. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. Margot sat at the head of the table, still holding that smug smile. But as I placed the documents in front of the board, the room fell silent. Margot's smile faltered. "I'm here today to put an end to Margot's manipulation," I began, my voice steady. "I've gathered evidence, proof, that she's been spreading lies and trying to destabilize this neighborhood for her own personal gain." The board members looked at the evidence in shock. And Margot tried to protest, but her words were weak. It was over. The board voted unanimously to censure Margot, stripping her of any remaining authority in the HOA. As I walked out of the meeting, the weight of everything we'd been through started to lift. The neighborhood was free from Margot's grip, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a deep sense of relief. That night, I stood in my yard watching the sun set over the neighborhood. It felt like a new chapter was beginning, not just for me but for the whole community. And as I turned to head inside, I saw a moving truck across the street. It wasn't Margot. It was a new family ready to start their life in her old house. The neighborhood was changing, and I couldn't be more excited for what came next. The weeks that followed Margot's downfall were peaceful, almost eerily so. It felt like a collective exhale from the entire neighborhood. No more surprise fines, no more oppressive rules, no more constantly looking over your shoulder. The weight of Margot's tyranny had lifted. And for the first time in ages, it felt like we could breathe again. Still, I knew better than to believe it was over. Bullies like Margot don't just disappear. They find a way to come back. I was right. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard the unmistakable hum of an engine outside. A black SUV rolled up in front of my house, and my stomach dropped. The door swung open. Hand out stepped Margot. My first thought was disbelief, then anger. After everything, she was back. Margot marched toward my driveway, her face as determined as ever. "Evan," she called, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, bracing myself for another round of her nonsense. "What now, Margot?" "I'm not backing down," she said, a smirk tugging at her lips. "The HOA is mine, and I'm going to take back my position as president. You'll see, this neighborhood needs me." I couldn't hold back a laugh. "Is that so? After everything that's happened, you think you can just waltz back in and reclaim your power?" Her expression darkened. "Don't underestimate me. Evan, I've built this community and I will take it back. You can't control everything here." I stared at her for a moment, watching the barely concealed desperation in her eyes. "You've lost," I said flatly. "This neighborhood isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the people who live here." For a moment she seemed to stiffen, her jaw clenched in frustration. But she wasn't done. "You haven't heard the last of me." "Heaven!" she hissed, before turning and storming off. I watched her go, a sense of unease creeping in. It was clear she wasn't ready to let go of her power, and I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last I'd see of her. The next day, a notice arrived for an emergency HOA meeting. Margot was back and she was making her move. I had a feeling she wasn't going to give up without a fight. But this time I wasn't going to let her win. The neighborhood had already seen what she was capable of, and they weren't going to let her take control again. At the meeting, the air was thick with tension. As I walked in, I could feel the eyes of the board members on me, waiting to see what would happen next. Margot sat there, her face a mask of determination, ready to fight for her position once again. But I had something she didn't evidence. I stood up and addressed the room. "It's time we finally put an end to this," I said. "Margot's manipulation ends here. I've gathered the evidence to prove it." As I slid the folder across the table, Margot's face turned pale. The room was dead silent as the board members flipped through the documents. There was no turning back now. The board voted unanimously to strip Margot of any remaining power in the HOA, and she was officially removed from her position. The room erupted into murmurs, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of victory. The days following, Karen's removal from her position as HOA president were surprisingly peaceful. It felt like a collective breath of fresh air had swept through the neighborhood. People seemed lighter, freer, as if the dark cloud that had hovered over us for so long had finally disappeared. Kids played in the streets without fear of reprimands. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries, some even stopping to chat on their evening walks. I didn't realize how much we'd been holding our breath until Karen was gone. But as much as I wanted to bask in this newfound peace, I knew that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. The feeling of unease was always in the back of my mind. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. One crisp afternoon, as I was sitting in my living room, I saw a figure outside my window, a familiar one. There, standing on the sidewalk, was Karen. She looked different somehow, more determined, and yet there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, gazing at my house with a tight smile. She wasn't here to apologize. I could tell that much. She marched up the driveway to my front door, and I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't sure what she would say this time, but I knew it wouldn't be anything good. "Evan," Karen called, her voice strained but oddly polite. "I need to speak with you." I opened the door and leaned against the frame, crossing my arms. "What now, Karen?" I asked, the irritation creeping into my tone. "I've come to tell you that I'm not backing down," she said, her face hardening with determination. "The HOA is still mine. I'm going to reclaim my position as president. You'll see. The neighborhood needs me." A laugh bubbled up in my throat, but I suppressed it. "Karen, the neighborhood doesn't need you. You've already caused enough chaos. You're out." Her eyes flickered with a hint of panic, but she quickly masked it with a veneer of confidence. "So you haven't won yet, Evan," she said, stepping closer. "This neighborhood will be mine again, and you'll see just how powerful I am." I held my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "No one here wants you in charge anymore, Karen. It's over." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving me standing in the doorway, the weight of the situation settling heavily on my shoulders. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the HOA, calling for an emergency meeting to address Karen's latest complaints. She had filed a formal grievance against me, accusing me of disrupting the neighborhood's unity, and claiming that I was a threat to the HOA's stability. I couldn't believe it. Karen was trying to turn the tables once again, but this time I was ready. The battle for control of the neighborhood wasn't over. This time I wouldn't back down. The HOA meeting was packed with members eager to see what would happen next. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze as I walked in. Karen was already there, sitting smugly at the table. But there was an undeniable tension in the room. The board members were watching her closely, and I knew they were starting to question her. As the meeting went on, Karen tried to twist the narrative in her favor, but the evidence was clear. I stood up and presented everything, every email, every interaction, every violation. The truth was undeniable. The board members listened, and one by one their expressions changed. It wasn't long before they voted, and the result was final. Karen was removed. The tension that had held the room in place for so long finally evaporated. The days following, Karen's removal from her position as HOA president, were surprisingly peaceful. The neighborhood, which had been weighed down by her oppressive rule, now thrived in a fresh new atmosphere. People were actually talking to each other again, laughing and chatting in the streets. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without fear of reprimands, and for the first time in ages, I didn't dread walking outside. The shift in energy was palpable. But just as quickly as the peace arrived, an uneasy stillness began to settle over me. I knew Karen wouldn't leave quietly. It wasn't just that she'd been removed, it was the way she clung to power. She wasn't the type to give up easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something that would shake the foundation of everything we had worked for.